This is Beyond the Bubble, Poverty, Take 3, Camera 1. Camera 2.
Bryce, I'd like to pick up on something that we were discussing before the break, and this is the notion of setting targets. So although there is flexibility for how those targets might be set, what is your feeling about some of the risks that setting targets creates?
Yes, when I'm sceptical about politicians setting targets, you know, whether it's to get New Zealand in the top half of the OECD by 2010, or to close the income gap with Australia by 2025, or to have a carbon neutral society by 2025, or
be carbon free.
Yeah.
By 2025?
Yes, or eliminating the road toll by 2020. I mean, politicians, setting targets sounds good, and as long as Brian Easton says in his submission, as long as the time frame's well outside the tenure of this politician, you can never hold them to account for not achieving them. So setting arbitrary targets for yourself is the easy part. But people are dealing with real actual problems, massive problems in housing, massive problems with low education and not picking up the skills needed for the 21st century, problems that the government was checking with rheumatic fever and women not having professional care at childbirth, and so unnecessarily hospitalisation treatment for the kids. Things which are clear problems which should be doing something about. The nervousness is that when you set a big grandiose target, that politicians can start gaming it, like their ways of giving people more income but then charging them more for schools. So their income's gone up, so they're above an income threshold, but their material circumstances are no better off. And if politicians are getting desperate to produce numbers that show they've got to a target, there are ways of doing that, sort of gaming them, which all of us would feel uncomfortable about.
Yeah. Donna, do you to use a phrase that's a little bit in vogue, virtue signalling, do you kind of think that there could be something in this notion of targeting that actually can?
I think that the setting the targets is really important in terms of giving the public sector some really clear messages that the government really needs to focus on these areas. I'm not so worried about the politicians gaming these measures now as they're being taken away from a ministry-delivered agenda to being put into the chief statistician's hand, which has an independent role. So I'm less anxious about the gaming of the overall targets. But they are really ambitious, and to get there, to see the results in actually both lowering the rates of income poverty and lowering the rates of material hardship at the same time, is going to require some really significant shifts, not just some incremental improvements. We're going to have some significant shifts in the types of policies that are designed and delivered and the ways that they're delivered in communities.
David?
Well, I think this is risk being a red herring debate. This is a Wellington-centric, intellectual going on about targets. Blah, blah, it's an blah blah. It's an It's an intellectualised. Like we actually need a paradigm shift, not debating about what the targets are. If we're talking about targets, let's actually have targets that are meaningful to people that are experiencing the hardship. So, for example, if I'm a guy, I'm 50, I've come out of prison, I've done my third lag. I want an agency, whoever, to work with me. It could be whānau order, it could be a social service organisation. I want to be able to set a target for myself that says, okay, I'm going to cut down my drinking and booze, and I'm going to sort of try and keep my licence for 6 months I want to set my target that's right for me, and then I want to get the right help to help me do it. And if I hit my target, then I want that measured I've achieved my target. And all you just do is aggregate up all those targets. So I would want to know, as a politician, how many of the people we're trying to help are actually achieving their targets. Because once I get one target, I get a sense of agency that I can do it. Yeah, so I'm going to lift it. My next one, I'm going to do a little bit. And why can't we have that conversation rather than the sort of macro, intellectual, and it becomes so detached from the real world of people that are bouncing around the system?
And of course, in order to achieve that kind of reflection of real targets being set by people to whom they matter the most, we require the transformation that you're talking about, Donna, because we have a public service, and I'm thinking in particular of MSD, we have a system that is very inflexible. So there is tension here, right, between flexibility of individuals and whānau and communities to set and meet their own targets, but the existence of this extraordinary, broad and all-encompassing welfare system. Bryce, what do you think about what kind of transformation is needed in order to ensure that systems don't get in the way of real poverty reduction?
Well, I think that's what Bill English's government was directly working hard to do, to sort of overcome the silo problem in government agencies where everyone's got their own patch. So if you're in education, it's an education problem. If it's health, it's a health problem, and you know how to deal with that. But really that might just be a manifestation of something else going on in the home. So the second leg to it was to try and get NGOs much more involved and measuring what's happening and rewarding those who were really getting results as properly measured. And that's hard to do, but it seems to me it's the best model that's in town. I think
there's a limitation there with that, Bryce, if I may, because the risk is with that we sort of frame government departments and officials as limited and rigid and siloed, and somehow this community and community organisations are somehow more flexible and in touch. And I actually think that's a bit of a simplistic view. When we talk about the system is the mindset that everybody in that system has. It doesn't matter if I'm a community or social worker that work in a community organisation, a Māori organisation, MSD, all that. I've got this assumption that my position and the training I have means that I can fix these people. And that's the mindset we need to really get in. And so I think by getting into this binary thing that, government are sort of limited and community are better, we miss the point that there's actually a whole set of really core assumptions we've got in the system that we need to surface and actually put some light on. And that's where I think, Minister English is sort of, because it gets into beating up and saying the public sector's terrible and they're really good and these ones are great. And I don't think that simplicity.
No, I'm sympathetic to that, but what about the Productivity Commission's navigator sort of model?
But all of those, the navigator, the giving, the incentivizing the NGOs, things like that. So we have a welfare system that is very rigid and limits what families can get and says, here's the rules, and will sanction you if you don't send your child to ECE. On the other hand, we have agencies trying to help families and going to their houses and saying, what do you need? And they're saying, well, we'd like some gas and extra money so we could drive our kids to ECE, but we're getting sanctions for not taking them. So we have parts working against each other. And the underlying value space that's saying we can incentivize and NGOs will somehow fix the family problems. Actually, the best way is just give the money directly to the families. Let them solve their own problem. Cut out some of the middleman and trust the people.
So we're in a situation now where just recently Jacinda Ardern and the Leader of the Opposition, Simon Bridges, thank you, they've been meeting in regards to addressing poverty issues. Do you see this as a sign of the beginnings of bipartisanship in an area that has been so riven with disagreement for decades, actually, at least since the 80s? Or do you, and in keeping with the kind of values transformation that you're referring to, Donna, or is this more window dressing and those problems still remain?
I think that this was bubbling up before the election, and particularly saw it in the last leaders' debate before the election. Both the former Prime Minister and the now Prime Minister made quite staunch commitments to reducing child poverty. And this was going to happen because the people in New Zealand got it and are seeing the change. And when they were doing their UMR and Colmer Bruton polling, whoever, it was still topping out as the most important issue for the leading up to the election. So this is something that New Zealanders said they care deeply about. That's driving the change.
Yeah. Do you share that optimism?
No, I see government...
Come on, Bryce. A little, just a little.
Yeah, no, I see government pulling in all sorts of different directions at once, like putting up the minimum wage. That's making it even harder for employers to afford someone who they couldn't afford at the lower minimum wage. The best thing for the only thing which will produce high wages at the bottom end is more productivity. the Michael Riddell's blogs just commented on Jacinda's pre-election speech, and he said there was virtually no reference at all to raising productivity growth there. Giving a year's free education to tertiary students, that's not going to do anything to help the kids. It's money which could have been used down at the bottom. So the $1 billion a year on planting trees, that's money which could have been used and better targeted.
We're not here to have a debate about all the policies of the current government or the previous one. We're supposed to,
we're discussing how committed the government is, and it's easy, as I said before, for governments to set grandiose targets beyond their term of office. But we've learned what we want to see is policies in place happening to really help where the problems are. So the housing, education, sort of mental illness, income to a degree, access to jobs.
Yeah.
So let's talk about
jobs.
Parliament as opposed to government, because that's what interests me, because all the international evidence about shifting complex issues like poverty is you've got to have a collaboration. You have multiple views, but you've got to form some broad agreement. Now, unless Parliament can actually, this is an opportunity for it to step up and actually get some agreement. Now, yes, they'll have some differences about the mix and how they spend it. I mean, that's fine, that's part of the Westminster system, but they've actually got to get some lock-ins, some universal says this is what we want to do and we're prepared to join up on that. If they can pull that off, then I think that's fantastic. So I'm the optimist.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap it up at this point today. Thank you both. Thank you all. Ka nui te mihi ki a koutou katoa mō a koutou kōrero I tēnei wā. And that concludes our session today for Beyond the Bubble, looking at poverty. Kia ora tātou.
We could have gone on.
We could have. We're just warming up.